Our message from today comes from 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 3. I'll read it for you. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save, as he may prosper, so that no collections may be made when I come. When I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem. This is the word of God. You may be seated.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And for those of you worshiping with us in the chapel, thank you, Nick, who read it there. My name's Joe Springer. I'm a senior associate pastor here at Bethany, and thrilled to have the opportunity to share and worship with you this morning. We're kind of standing between a couple of series. Of course, we finished up our Advent series, and then next week we'll launch into a study on the book of Joshua that should take us for a couple of months. And so I get the opportunity to kind of speak here in this lone week and to speak really around the issue of this new year of 2015. What kinds of things have our attention in the coming year? And I'll confess some ambivalence around the New Year stuff. Whenever we come to the New Year, I get really, really annoyed with the kind of year in review stuff. Every website that you open, every TV channel that you turn to, it's like top 10 celebrity moments of 2014. I'm like, I don't care about any of the top 10 celebrity moments. Top 10 touchdown, top 10 news stories of 2014. I think I was there. Like if I can read this story, I have my own list of top 10 news stories from 2014. And I think a part of the reason it drives me nuts is I am probably more naturally inclined to look forward, to look into this new year. And I realize that for some of you, that's probably equally as annoying, that you're the type who like to reflect on the year that was. But I think that as we come to a new year, it's inevitable. It's inevitable that we find ourselves thinking about what is it that this new year holds, and what is it that I might be being called to, and whether you're the kind of pro-resolution type or the anti, if we're going to make that resolution, we should just live that way all the time type. I think all of us are compelled to at least think out into a new year. This year, my wife, Allison, she asked me if I had made any resolutions for 2015, and I really hadn't. But I was able to share that I've been thinking about the new year, and I realized that this is going to be a wildly different year for us. A really different year for me. That 2015 will be the first full year that I will live as a dad. And since my boy was born in July, it has changed how I understand myself. It's changed my understanding of my call. It's changed my understanding of my purpose. My fundamental identity in life shifts. In the last 5 months, and 2015 will be the first year that I live into that fully. And God forbid, even if something were to ever happen to Will, it would never change the fact that I will forever identify myself now as his father. 2015 will be the first year in my married life with my wife where I will know her outside of the context of her surgical training. We were married in the first year of medical school, first of 4 years. We endured 5 years of residency together. She'll finish up her fellowship, and this will be, after 9+ years of marriage, the first time that I will live with my wife outside of the context of her surgical training. Maybe the first time I live with my wife at all. In many respects, we just haven't seen a great deal of each other over those years. For me personally, 2014, a number of my friends were kind of the last of my really closest friends to move out of the state and even the country in some contexts. And so in 2015, as I look ahead, I think about what does it mean for me to be connected to a community of people different than the ones that I have historically been connected with. That I can't help but find myself looking ahead, and I do so with excitement and some anticipation. There's certainly some trepidation in the midst of that as well, and I think that we're all inclined to do this as we stand at the beginning of a year, at our personal level, but also at a larger level as well. And so as we were kind of reflecting on what is it that we would talk about this Sunday, and I met with Richard, who for those of you who may be new to Bethany or just visiting, Richard's our senior pastor. And I met with our other pastors as well. There are a number of other Bethany congregations. And so Pastor Scott up in Shoreline at Bethany North, and Jack at Northeast in Lake City, Shawnee in West Seattle, Brad, who this morning is preaching over on the east side. We don't have a pastor for them, but there's this kind of growing online congregation. There's over 200 people a week who worship online with us at Bethany. And some of them, this is their normal church home, and for whatever reason, they're just home this week, and there are others who have never been here. But so we're reflecting, what is it that faces us as a church in 2015? And I realize that as I say that, like the institutional answer of what faces us as a church could be like, could veer into the very logistical and be really boring. And so I'm not talking about what's facing Bethany 2015 and giving you a status update of the church as much as I am what's facing us as individuals, as a community who comprise, in part, this community. And I realize that there are some among us who are saying, man, this is my first time at Bethany. I'm a visitor. I fly home tomorrow. There are others of you who are going, man, if this sermon doesn't pick up, this will be my last time at Bethany. And so I realize that some of you are saying, man, I don't know that I identify myself yet as a part of the body, and yet each of us, as we place faith in Christ, as we look at the text this morning, we'll see that each of us is called to be a part of some larger whole. And so in reality, the issue facing the institution of the church is in some ways just a macrocosm, of what I think that we're facing as individuals. And I'll explain that. And the passage that Ellie read, or Nick read for us, really does begin to allude to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul's writing to the Corinthians, and he's imploring them to take this offering, and the offering isn't significant. We're not talking about money. We're talking about participation in the life of a community. That he's compelling the church at Corinth to participate in the life of the church in Jerusalem. He says, I want for you to take this offering that's to go to the saints in Jerusalem, and you are going to participate in the life of this community that is the church in Jerusalem. And the churches in Corinth and the churches in Jerusalem couldn't be more different than they are. Corinth is this very cosmopolitan city. It's a very Gentile city. People have sometimes tried to equate it as somewhere between Las Vegas and New York. Whereas Jerusalem and the church in Jerusalem is rooted in Judaism, has this much deeper sort of historical kind of feeling, and yet Paul is imploring the church at Corinth to participate in the life of the church in Jerusalem, and this isn't unique to 1 Corinthians 16. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul talks of the Macedonian churches, these churches that would be very, very poor, and they too have compiled an offering and are participating in the life of the church in Jerusalem. And what's significant is that each of these various entities don't see themselves as simply being for the church in Jerusalem, but they see themselves as the church in Jerusalem. They see themselves as a part of a much larger whole. They're one collective organism. They're one church in many locations. And that's actually the language that we'll use at Bethany when we talk about there's this overarching thing that is Bethany, and then there are these various churches. There's Green Lake and North and Northeast and West Seattle and East Side and whoever else. That we go, one church, many locations. They're unique and they're separate, and yet they're united and they're inextricably linked. But to get into the kind of the minutiae of that would be an organizational dynamic, totally boring. But again, it's rooted in an individual reality. And if you're somebody who takes notes, we don't have an outline for you in the bulletin, but this would be your first point. The first point is this, that you are less an individual entity than you are a part of a living organism. You are less an individual entity than you are a part of a living organism. And again, I'm not talking about Bethany Community Church. Talking about this larger community of faith, but we'll see that as we go. But I'll tell you that even as I say that out loud, I don't like it. It doesn't sit well with me. Something about this notion that I'm less an individual entity, that I am a part of a larger collective organism, doesn't sit well with me. And yet as we come to the scripture, we see, and maybe for some a familiar passage, if we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we're given this image of a body. And the reality is that each of us is called to live into a particular identity within a larger whole. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 12 through 18, then I'm going to skip down to 25 through 27. Paul, speaking to the same church as in 16, says, "For even as the body is one, and yet has many members, and all the members of the body, though they are many, are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all made to drink of one Spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot says, 'Because I am not a hand, I am not a part of the body,' it is not for this reason any less a part of the body. And if the ear says, because I am not an eye, I am not a part of the body, it is not for this reason any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole were a hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But now God has placed the members, each one of them, in the body just as he desired. Skipping down to 25. So that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. And if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. Now you are Christ's body, and individually members of it. But again, it is for us, I think, a familiar image, this notion of we are a body. We're many parts, but we're one body. But I will tell you, my natural inclination as I come to that passage, the first question I ask, what part of the body am I? What do I look like? What is my unique call? What am I here on earth for? What is God's will for my life? That I'm just predisposed towards thinking that the body can't really be healthy unless I first am a really healthy part of the body. So my primary focus has to be a really healthy foot. And then as I live into that health, I become connected to the body, and then we'll be healthier as this sort of whole collective. I think of the body as being an intended ideal. But that notion is absurd if we take the metaphor seriously. What would it mean for me to be a healthy foot disconnected from the body? How could I possibly pursue my own health outside of the context of some larger whole? But again, my natural inclination is I don't affiliate or associate myself as my first instinct with the body. I think of it as being a future reality that someday we'll live into that more completely. But as we come to 1 Corinthians 12, we realize this is more of a body passage than it is a parts passage. And the question becomes for us, what if, before I am an individual entity, I'm a part of some larger organism? What if my health, my vitality is predicated, necessitated by me being connected to a larger whole? And again, I will tell you, I do not think this way. In part, probably, I'm an introvert. And by that, I simply mean I really get energy, am vitalized from being on my own. It's also the excuse I use for the fact that I'm really a private person. I enjoy my own company, partially because I entertain myself, partially because the reality is that as I move outside of myself, it requires vulnerability, and with vulnerability comes intimacy. With intimacy comes mess. And so I'm inclined, in part because of my private self, to not perceive myself as a part of a larger entity. I think I also don't perceive myself as a part of a larger entity because of my Western context. That I was born and raised in a context that says things to us like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This great poem by William Henley, Invictus, resonates with me. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. Say, yeah. That I like to imagine myself as this lone oak, and I'm the only person who sees myself this way, but I like to imagine myself as this lone oak buffeted by the winds and the weather, but sturdy unto itself, as though unaware of the fact that even that oak is a part of an ecosystem. That it requires the light of the sun and the nutrients of the soil, the water of the rain and the stream in order to give it life. But there's something in my Western self that isn't predisposed to thinking of myself as being a part of a larger entity. I'm embarrassed to say I don't gravitate towards thinking that way, in part because I am some form of evangelical. That I was raised, my faith was nurtured and formed in a context that used almost exclusively language like Jesus is your personal Lord and Savior. And that is 100% true. Christ died for my sins, and Christ died for your sins. But if we continue to read, we see in Colossians chapter 1, where it is said of Christ that at his death, all things were reconciled unto him through the cross. And it's not to say that all things were saved in that moment. Okay, I'm not saying that. It's a different conversation. But it says that something much grander happened at the cross of Christ than simply my salvation. My salvation is a part of it. But something much bigger happened. And yet I don't find myself naturally thinking that way. It isn't even my religious, my faith training. My faith training has taught me that it's about me. I live in this very Joe-centric universe, and I'm just going to, forgive me, I'm going to project onto you that I think many of us live in a me-centric universe. And the concern for us is that as we do that, our understanding of God is diminished as we live as an isolated part. Similarly, our understanding of what it means to be human, to be the creators created, is diminished as we live as an isolated part. So what do I mean by this? First, our understanding of God is diminished as we live as isolated parts. My vantage point is inherently limited. My understanding and perspective of God is boundaried by who I am. And it's not to say that my understanding of God is in some way wrong. No, it's critical, as is yours. It's indispensable. But it is flawed in that it is inherently incomplete. That my understanding of who Christ is shaped by the fact that I'm a man, that I'm affluent, that I'm secure, that I live in the wealthiest nation in the history of humanity. These inform how I understand who God is. They shape, and in some cases, misshape, how I understand God. My perspective is critical, but it's only one facet of who God is. A seminary professor named Mark Allen Powell, reflecting on this phenomenon, conducted a very interesting study in looking at the prodigal son. And we're familiar with the story of the prodigal, but I want to read a piece of it to you from Luke chapter 13. And I'm just going to read, Luke chapter 15, 13 through 17. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. We know this story, right? Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger?" And as Powell reflected on this passage, he sat with 100 American seminary students who would look very much like you or I. I was an American seminary student. And he asked them the question, in having studied the story of the prodigal son, why is the son hungry? 100 out of 100 students said because he squandered his estate on loose living. An additional 6 of the 100 referenced as a secondary answer in verse 14 that there was also a famine in the land. Verse 14 makes it very clear there's a famine in the land. He then asked the same question to Russian seminary students. And in asking 100 Russian students, why is the prodigal son hungry? 84 out of 100 said, because there is a famine in the land. Why is their perspective on the text so wildly different? Because their social contexts have been informed by such different things that the Russian seminary students have emerged from a culture in which famine is a part of how they understand themselves. And so as they come to the text, it's not merely about him spending his financial capital, but it's the fact that he's a part of a world in which famine is a very present reality. He then similarly asked 100 students from around the continent of Africa the same question of why is the prodigal son hungry, and the overwhelming majority of them pointed to verse 16 that says nobody gave him anything to eat. That here are a group of people whose cultural context is tribal, it's connective. That they're going, he's hungry because his financial capital is one thing, but he has no social capital. Who are his people? He's totally isolated. There's nobody to give him any food. Of course he's hungry. The ways in which we understand who God is, even as God is revealed in the biblical witness, varies wildly based on the perspective by which we engage the text. And if we come to God alone, we are destined to see and experience God in two dimensions. There's a very real potential danger. I think one of the greatest gifts that's been given to this community in the 5 years that I've been here has been some of our global partnership with Uganda and Rwanda specifically. We have partners in Costa Rica as well. But the teaching ministry of this church, which is largely in the hands of Richard Dahlstrom, the senior pastor, has been wildly informed in the last 5 years by his experience of having been to Rwanda. When we think of our partnerships with Rwanda, it's easy to think about us going, yeah, we as a church, we give money and it goes there. And we're not as inclined to see the fact that this perspective that has emerged as Richard engaged in relationships and as Ellie and myself and others among us have engaged in these relationships, we begin to realize that there is a perspective that is a profound gift to us around who God is and how we might understand God differently that would not have existed had it not been for the relationships that Richard and others have been able to develop. That to be in relationship with a pastor who 20 years ago, there was this genocide, of course, in Rwanda, 1 in every 7 people murdered. A million people, the majority of them murdered by their neighbors in the most Christian country in all of Africa. And the shame that these pastors felt and the fact that they had raised these congregations only to see this happen. And now suddenly this incredible story of forgiveness and reconciliation that emerges out of that. In this unfettered submission to Christ. And it has informed who we are as a community. And it's imperative that it does. It's an aspect of God that I cannot know because the realities and the horrors of genocide are foreign to me. In the same way, our understanding of what it means to be human is diminished as we live as isolated parts as well. Second half of that passage that I read in Corinthians 12, 25 through 27, where Paul says, if one suffers, all suffer. If one is honored, we all rejoice with them, or as one rejoices, we all rejoice. And the reality is that as we enter into the hurt of those around us, oftentimes it's a very vicarious hurt. We experience a compassion and empathy that open us up to a part of the human story with which we can't possibly identify because it's not a part of my immediate experience. And so as I enter into a relationship with somebody who has encountered God, has encountered humanity very differently than I have, it begins to reveal something to me of my own nature as a human being. That just this last week, I opened one of the dozens of videos that go through your Facebook feed that you ignore. And for whatever reason, one of them I clicked on, and it was this story about slavery, about modern-day slavery and human trafficking. And I will confess to my own great shame that my brain thinks of slavery as something that we have moved beyond. And somehow, as I'm hearing this story, I'm pulled in to the suffering of others. And I realize a responsibility that exists for me. I begin to realize some of the brokenness of humanity of which I am a part in any number of different ways. And it also reveals something to me of these places where God is trying to shine God's light into the midst of it. And it's oftentimes as we suffer with those who suffer that we begin to experience some of who it is that we are being called to be as a unique or individual part. How often does one's experience of a loved one who dealt with the difficulties of addiction lead to them walking with people who are going through addiction? That as we suffer with those who suffer, it begins to form in us an understanding of God's call on our lives. But not only suffering with those who suffer, we're also called to rejoice with those who rejoice. And doing this is also incredibly formative in terms of how we understand who we are as people of the living God. But it's often very painful in the sense that rejoicing in others' joy can tell us a bit of who we are by telling us a little bit of what we are not. And what I mean by that is simply this, that in some ways, it's easier for me to put my joy of my own life on the shelf and to suffer with you in empathy than it is for me to put my own suffering on the shelf and to rejoice with you when it might actually remind me of my own pain. What do I mean? I would imagine there are some in here who are tired of celebrating another engagement story. That yes, I'm happy for you, I'm happy to participate in your wedding, but at the same time, even in that I'm reminded of my own longing, of something that I may want for my own life. That it may be difficult for that person who's going to a 40th or 50th anniversary party for somebody that they care about to rejoice purely with you as they reflect on what could have been and their own loss of a partner. I realize that even as I share stories about me having become a dad, and as we dedicate babies up in front here, there are people for whom that elicits very real pain. It points us towards a longing that we have. And yet we are called to rejoice with those who rejoice. Because in doing that, it points us towards a collective and future hope. We are reminded of the fact, even in my own suffering, as I come into your joy, I'm reminded of the fact that death, that despair, that sadness, none of these have the final word. But rather we are each moving on a certain trajectory towards hope, where moth and rust will not destroy, where there will no longer be any tears, but the glory of God will fill the whole earth. That your joy points me to that. And I realize in saying that it can sound trite, and I certainly recognize how terribly difficult it is. But we need to be reminded that the joy of others is intended to minister to us, even in our own pain. God has designed us to be a part of a larger organism. And again, please don't mishear me. I'm not talking about Bethany. For those of us for whom Bethany is home, Bethany is a part of it. But each and every single one of us has been called to be a part of something larger, this community of faith. And the community of faith should be eclectic and diverse and complex. And when that happens, it's more than likely going to be contentious. If it's done really well, it ought to be this beautiful mess of these various different perspectives of people who are so wildly different, that who are disconnected by their experience and their geography and their gender and their race, and yet held together. Held together by what? That becomes the second point in the outline. What is it that then unites us? If we're called to be more than just an individual entity, what is it that unites us? Paul in Colossians chapter 1, verse 17 says, "And he, Christ, is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. And he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself might come to have first place in everything. We are many parts, we are a single body, held together by Christ. Christ is preeminent." What is it that unites us? Jesus, right? And you go, I knew it. It's a classic Sunday school answer, right? The answer is always Jesus when I come to church. And in some ways, I will say that answer is a little bit too easy in light of the conversation we've just been having. It's Jesus that unites us, but which Jesus? And by that I mean which perspective? Which image of Christ? The liberation Jesus? Feminist Jesus? Capitalist Jesus? Buddy Jesus? Who is it that unites us? And this is why sometimes in the context of the church, we end up feeling threatened by this notion of being united solely by Christ, because it begins to hint to us of pluralism. That people go, man, this is where the conversation suddenly begins, and somebody's going to say, hey, can't we all just agree that Jesus was all about love, and then love just has to be enough? And hear me, no, we can't. We can't just simply agree to that. Yes, Jesus says that he is love, but at no point does Jesus say that love is Jesus. Jesus does not say, love is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by love. Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. There is a narrow gate. And so some of us, we hear that and we go, yeah, now we're talking. Talking about a revelation Jesus who's going to come with a sword, and he is going to provide judgment for the apostate and vindication for the righteous. And I know which side I'm on. And I go, ooh, careful. The Pharisees had this same situation at the end of Matthew, when they said, Jesus is telling the story about separating the sheep and the goats, and they identify themselves as the beloved. And Christ says to them, get away from me, I never knew you. And they go, what? That we need to be careful with whatever perspective from which we come to avoid this notion of self-righteousness, but rather for each of us to be called in to this robust conversation of interdependent, connected, and wildly different members of the body, because in doing so, we will gain an understanding of what it means to be unified in Christ. It is precisely in this sort of milieu, this context, that we begin to see doctrine develop that is faithful and also humble. And hear me when I say right doctrine is imperative. It is absolutely imperative. That without it, we move towards heresy, and heresy invariably moves us away from Christ. Right? We've seen heresy take the church into places of legalism and plurality. We've seen heresy manifest itself in white supremacy or National Socialism in 1930s and 40s Germany. And these are to be avoided at all cost. But at the same time, we must be aware that some of what starts for us as heresy can be revealed as truth. Martin Luther was a heretic, cast out of the Catholic Church because he dared to suggest the absurd. That humanity's relationship with God had been mediated through the ministry of Christ and no longer required the priesthood. Something that we would all accept. He's my personal Lord and Savior, man. We've come to accept what was once heresy, but there needed to be an openness to be willing to hear it. The abolition of slavery began as being perceived as a misrepresentation of the biblical witness and heretical, and yet for us becomes how we understand what it means for us to be equal. That we constantly live in this tension of trying to discern right doctrine as a necessity, and yet being humble enough to be willing to allow God to continue to reveal God's self to us. And the best way for us to manage this tension is through relationships with other part of the body. Actual, God-honest, meaningful relationships with other part of the body. When I find myself in relationship, particularly with people with whom I'm not inclined to agree, my faith begins to be formed in the crucible of another's experience. That it's one thing for me to know what it is that I believe, and it suits me just fine, but it isn't until I begin to actually know you and know what it is that you have experienced that I begin to ask the question of, does my faith continue to hold water in that context? Because if it doesn't, it may not be robust enough. God may be calling me into something grander, something bigger than what it is that I presently perceive. To tease this out in the context of relationship means there is a safe environment where the person with whom I am in dialogue is a trusted source. I believe that they have my best interest in mind, that they want for me to grow in my understanding of who it is that Christ is calling me to be, that's their primary concern, though we differ wildly in other areas. And it begins to test my convictions amidst my challenges and not my comfort. Too often, the parts of the body, and to me, this week, I had this ridiculous image. Sometimes the hands of the body, and it happens with all the parts of the body, they just get together and they just high five, right? Just a big bucket of hands all going, man, haven't we figured it out? We're hands. And they're disconnected. And we do the same thing. Too often, we sequester ourselves among a community of folks who are saying the exact same thing that we're saying. And as we do that, we not only have our image of God diminished, but we lose unity in who it is that God is collectively calling us to be. And a part of the reason that this is so significant, not only for us as individuals, but now I'll speak for a moment as a whole church, is that for those of you who are worshiping in the chapel, as you walked in this morning, you walked under a sign that says, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. And that is the governing ethos of this community. It's not our mission statement, but 9 out of 10 pastors wouldn't be able to tell you our mission statement, let alone congregants. The majority of us have heard that phrase. In essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. We've heard it because it's on our literature. We've heard it because if we've gone through membership, we talk about it all the time. When we have a gathering of people who are new to Bethany, we share this phrase where we say, in essentials, unity, and non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, charity. We talk about it all the time, and what's funny is that as we do, invariably, the first question is, what are the essentials? And oftentimes there's an underlying current of, why aren't your essentials the same as mine? And so as we identify it's Christ who unifies us, part of our language is to say the essentials unify us. So what is essential? In the broadest sense, Paul gives us an answer in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. He says, I presume to know nothing while I was with you but Jesus Christ and him crucified. Wow. I presume to know nothing while I was with you but Jesus Christ and him crucified. Didn't stop me from writing all of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, right? I was kind of in on Romans, Ephesians, right? I presume to know nothing, but he's saying in the midst of all of it, in the midst of all of the things that I've known, of all the things that I've spoken to, the one thing that I am telling you is that the one thing that I know is Jesus Christ and him crucified. Paul is talking about the person who met him on a road and changed his life. Saying, to begin with, that's essential. That unifies us. Well, what unifies us beyond that in a broader sense of Bethany? Well, the creedal statements, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, these things that have historically sort of boundaried orthodoxy. Yeah, those unify us as well. Those are essential. Believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Right? But I want to issue each of us a challenge. That as we ask that question, what is essential? I would ask that as we engage the collective community this year, might we be willing to at least suppose that there is a possibility of one fewer or one more essential than you may be naturally inclined to agree with. And I share that because some of us fall into a camp where we go, yeah, I know the essentials, there are 7 of them. And if you're not hitting all 7, I have a sense of where you are. And I go, what would it look like to have the humility to at least ask the question, might there be one fewer? There are others among us who go, hey man, essentials, as many essentials as you need for your relationship with God to really be what you would hope it to be. And I go, let's at least be willing to consider, is there the possibility of maybe one more? At least one more. And this is some of our challenge. As we talk about what are the essentials of this community, which is always an ongoing conversation, part of the reality is we're going to discern that together. Because we are an organism, a part of a larger organism. That we are a part of a history of faith. And each and every single one of us is called in to be a part of this. And I want to challenge you in the coming year to allow this potentially to be a year to move deeper in to that larger organism, whether that's here at Bethany or wherever it is that you worship or choose to worship after today. What does it look like for you to move more deeply in? Over the last year, Pastor Nancy Eckert, our pastor of small groups, has been training small group leaders like it's going out of style because we believe that small groups are the primary place in which we encounter people in meaningful, real, and ongoing ways. And that forms us. And the more that I get to know you and spend time with you, the more I begin to love you and dislike you. And it's in disliking you that I begin to understand how it is that you perceive Christ. I dislike you because you haven't figured out what I have figured out. And then I begin to get to know you and I go, oh man, you understand God differently. because famine is a part of your context. In the same way, I would encourage you to explore your gifts and your passions. That whether, again, it's in the context of this community or we can help you find places to serve outside of the context of this community. But as you experience the suffering of others or the joy of others, what is it that's evoked in you? What are you called into? What is it that God has built you to be? One of the ways that we discern what part of the body that we are is to be connected to the body as a whole. The body will help us figure that out. Again, I think our global partnerships are a huge help to this, but each and every single one of us, and every one of us is a part of this larger organism. We're a part of an ecosystem. And I began by saying this is a question that we ask at the macro, right? Like, this is one of the issues that faces us as a church. We realize that the church can do a much better job, and I mean this church, Bethany, can do a better job of sharing each other's stories. We can do a better job of revealing the passions that people in this community have as they help elicit in me a sense of God's call on my life. We can do a better job of sharing our heartaches and where we feel broken. We can do a better job of sharing life's great joys. We can do a better job of sharing some of what it is that God is doing through us collectively. That like the church in Macedonia, like the church in Corinth, like the church in Jerusalem, we are not simply for one another, but we are one another. That you are a part of Bethany, West Seattle. You go, I've never even been there. I go, yep, and yet God is doing something through you in that place. And we can do a better job of telling the stories of what it is that you are doing in West Seattle. And you go, well, why would I need to know what I'm doing in West Seattle? Because we are a part of this larger whole. Even as we come to this table this morning, that the way in which we take communion and the way in which the church has historically taken communion, much of the church, is that as the bread comes to you, you'll be invited to take it as an individual. But as you receive the cup, hold it. Hold that cup. And together, we will celebrate the forgiveness of Christ as a single body.